The Murder Shelf Book Club contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Listener discretion is advised.
I cautiously make my way down the dirt path in the woods adjacent to the mobile home park. I know it's going to be bad, but I still keep walking. I have a bit of a déjà vu moment as I walk under the canopy of towering evergreens towards the site, knowing what I will find. I close my eyes and I think back to that warm summer night several years earlier when I felt the same kind of impending doom in the pit of my stomach as I approached her lifeless body. I know I'm about to witness a display of pure evil, and there's nothing I can do about it. Lindsey Wade, in my DNA, my career investigating your worst nightmares. Welcome to the Murder Shelf Book Club podcast. I am your host, Jill. This is episode 100, The Monster Inside, part 2 on In My DNA, My Career Investigating Your Worst Nightmares by retired detective Lindsey Wade. 100, episode 100, Murder Bookies. We did it. Yay! Thank you for being on this journey with me. In episode 99, Monsters Are Real, we met Lindsey Wade. We learned of her childhood, marred by the senseless murders of two little girls, Michelle Welch and Jennifer Bastian, ages 12 and 13 years old, when they were brutally assaulted and killed, with fear warping the community, the unknown killer lurking among them. A kid, Lindsey was wary as she rode her bike in the months and years following, as these cases went cold. In part 1, which I highly recommend listening to before you get to part 2, we got a very realistic view of what it actually means to be a cop, then a sex crimes detective, the obstacles they have to overcome to get to the arrest of a suspect, and then prosecute the case. Sadly, all cases are not equal, even as we seek equal justice for all. We also saw the nightmare give way as Lindsey achieved her dream of becoming a detective. Life is always complicated, with many threads running in between the pillars that support us as time goes forth. Oh, I'm very philosophical today, I guess. Well, Murder Bookies, here we go. In 2004, Lindsey Wade was transferred to the Special Assault Unit, working with detectives Gene Miller and Brad Graham. Older than her, with more years of experience, they never made her feel like a rookie. There is no training for new detectives. They rely on the old adage, if you have questions, ask. Her boss was Mary Robinette, a tough prosecutor, busy, but always willing to review Lindsey's cases with her, and she would become a valued mentor and role model. One of the first child abuse cases she worked with Gene. A woman and her boyfriend came to the hospital with their baby, who had bruises all over his head and face. Utterly furious when she saw the photos of this poor child, Lindsey demanded an explanation, and the parents blamed it on ghosts. Ghosts, yeah. This early surprise at the cruelty of some caretakers would sadly fade with experience after hearing excuses like the baby fell off the bed and suffered a massive skull fracture and brain damage, the killer bed scenario. Oh, do you remember when I did the book A Death in White Bear Lake about 3-year-old Dennis Jurgens? It still makes me weep. And a self-serving plug here, these are episodes 50 to 52. Gene was moved over to homicide in 2005, but they served on a permanent call-out team together. So when a situation arose, they were called out, reporting to investigate. Homicides, home invasion rapes, a life-threatening assault that looked like the victim might die, suicides and infant deaths, and all officer-involved shootings were their domain. There were 3 rotating call-out teams composed of 4 detectives, 2 from homicide and 2 from special assaults, with Lindsey and Jean joined by Dave DeVault and Brad Graham. On for 2 weekends, you were off for the next 4, rotating. It wasn't long before Brad grew to be like a brother to Lindsey, his dry sense of humor keeping the chuckles flowing, even in the worst of situations. Brad was also a fantastic interviewer, which meant he not only asked poignant questions, he was a superb listener. An early case she and Brad worked involved an infant brought into the Mary Bridge Children's Hospital by his father with a skull fracture and subdural hematoma. Unable to stop crying, the father admitted he had shaken the newborn. With video recording, the father demonstrated how he had shaken his son, the doll's head violently whipping back and forth, and then smacked it against the table, which stood in for the dresser. He admitted this because Brad was that good. He built up such strong rapport with the father that the dad wanted a hug from Brad when he was told he was going off to jail for assault. Over the years, they had interviewed many suspects, some of which were annoyed at being interviewed by a girl cop. Well, while this didn't faze Lindsey, Brad adopted this sexist phrase as a term of endearment, hijacking it to squelch its negative connotation. And good for him. Well, October 9th, 2005, an early Sunday morning, Jean and Lindsey were called out to a home where an invasion rape had occurred during the night. Just off 6th Avenue, 3 young people were roommates in the 2-story home. The exterior phone line had been cut, and the perpetrator climbed in through the basement window. At the hospital, the responding officers briefed them on what they'd learned so far, and one of them was skeptical about the story being told. Victim Amy Williams called 911 from her ex-boyfriend's house to report the incident. A masked man, armed with a gun, broke into their home in the middle of the night and sexually assaulted her. After the rape, Amy said she was forced to brush her teeth and bathe. After several hours, the rapist left and the roommates fled. Amy was in shock, her emotional affect totally flat. Now, to some, like the officer, this might have suggested she was making a false claim, given the lack of tears. However, Lindsey understood the varying reactions victims had to such assaults. The traumatized are not always visibly upset. The other roommates, Kara and Lauren, were also questioned, saying some unknown man broke in, demanded money, and tied them up, forcing them into the bathroom, using cords from the laundry to tie them up, and then put pillowcases over their heads. In 2005, Lindsey had not yet been trained on the impact of trauma on the brain, especially relevant in rape cases. We hear about the fight or flight response to threats, right? And many have thought, if someone tried to rape me, I'd scream and I'd fight back. Well, the truth is, we do not know how we would respond until we are actually faced with this horror, God forbid. However, there is a lesser-known third response, a third option: freeze, a defense mechanism as the brain works to keep you alive. So here comes my 2-minute lesson in survival neuroscience. Dr. Jim Hopper, an expert on the neurobiology of trauma and sexual assault, quote, "The brain's defense circuitry is a network of regions that constantly scans incoming sensory information for signs of danger. And once an attack is detected or stress otherwise escalates, can rapidly dominate brain functioning. And it can trigger many responses in the brain and body, much more that can ever be conveyed by the phrase, fight, flight, freeze," end quote. So universally among human beings, when stress and fear kick in, The rational, decision-making prefrontal cortex is impaired. Thinking can be taken offline. As a result, we have to rely on reflexive or habitual responses. Like generally, how do we deal with aggressive, dominant people that we encounter? Do we punch them in the face? Do we run away? Do we blow it off as no big deal? Okay, so for example, this habit may develop as a child dealing with an abusive situation. Behavior is influenced by many cultural factors: sex, class, age, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender. And this also explains why most perpetrators select their victims based on those power differentials and why they can generally depend on a victim's ineffective resistance and submission. Okay, does that make sense? I think it makes sense. Now, once our defense circuitry neurobiology kicks in, we're vulnerable. Extreme stress and fear, as in when a sexual assault is occurring, can result in paralysis, totally freezing up. Blood pressure and the heart rate can drop, and the victim can pass out. So I always try to explain to you the whys, and I really hope that that is helpful. By the way, Dr. Hopper is not a fan of the fight, flight, or freeze vernacular. He prefers survivor mode, which covers all victim response behaviors. Keep in mind, this is evolutionary psychology that the eons have hotwired into our psyches to protect us from assault and to enable survivability. As a result, and this is important for law enforcement and victims and families, victims do not always behave as logic might expect. Because a victim isn't crying and shaking, this doesn't mean what was being said isn't true. In Frozen in Fear, I recall Jane Carson Sandler saying that she laughed while recounting her rape by the Golden State Killer because she was so thankful to God for sparing her life while she was still horrifically traumatized. A flat affect, speaking about what happened in a very detached way, is as normal as hysterics. The account given of what happened also may not be in chronological order, and details may come forth, but not answers to basic questions. But still, 2005, Lindsey instinctively understood that Amy was in no condition to be formally interviewed. Kara went on to tell her that a man appeared in her doorway, with Kara grabbing a bat she had next to her bed. But he said he had a gun, so she relinquished the bat. Forcing Kara to kneel, he asked her where the money was, gun poised at the back of her head. And then he forced her and roommate Lauren into the bathroom, demanding $6,000. Where he thought they had $6,000, neither had any idea. Alone in the bathroom, Kara and Lauren tried to untie themselves, and they prayed as they listened to Amy's prolonged assault.
Oof.
Later, Amy would say that this assault began with Kara and the ski-masked intruder appearing next to her bed, demanding money. The commotion woke up Lauren, who tried to run downstairs and call 911, but was quickly caught. He then tied Lauren and Kara up in the bathroom. After assaulting her, wearing gloves, the rapist tried to wash away any evidence from Amy's body. He also made her brush her teeth. But before Amy bathed, she wiped semen from her face onto the bathroom floor. Finally, when he was gone, Amy called the police. Her attacker, a black man wearing a ski mask with eye and mouth holes. He smelled of cigarettes. His gun was a dark-colored revolver. Forensics found footprints on the wood deck and on the hardwood floor inside the bathroom. The toothbrush Amy used and the bath towel were collected for testing. On speaking to the DNA supervisor at the crime lab, he told Lindsey this attack was similar to another that had occurred last August in Faircrest. Situated between University Place and Tacoma, Faircrest was inherently safe with virtually no violent crime until then. So in Faircrest, early in the morning of August 19th, 2005, 19-year-old Gita Simpson woke up finding a masked man in her bedroom armed with a revolver. If she cried out, he'd kill her. Jada's mother had heard her scream coming in to see what the problem was. The suspect hid, with Jada convincing her mom she'd seen a spider, so Mom now went back to bed. Coming out, the intruder asked her where her phone was, with Jada lying and saying it was in her mother's room. He ordered her to strip and violently raped her, mentioning that he had seen Jada taking pictures in her room earlier in the evening. He forced Jada to swallow 2 red pills, then stuck the barrel of his gun in her mouth, tormenting her further. When finished, he made her kiss him and walk him to the door as if they were parting after a date. Calling 911, the Fircrest PD arrived. The suspect apparently had entered through an unlocked garage door. At the hospital, Jada underwent a sexual exam, and her rape kit was submitted for DNA analysis. Rush testing was requested for Jada and Amy's rape cases. Amy's identified a male DNA profile on the toothbrush. In Jada's case, the male DNA profile was found on a swab from her breast and neck. Both were from the same unknown male. Uploaded to CODIS, there were no matches. Media was notified, and bulletins were distributed that a serial rapist was on the loose. Washington State's Homicide Investigation Tracking System, HITS, notified other agencies of these attacks in Pierce County. Dozens of Crime Stopper tips came in, but nothing panned out. 19 days later, King County Sheriff Department Detective Mary Lisa Preby Olson called about a home invasion rape she was investigating, and it sounded a lot like Lindsey's case. Oh my God, there's more of them? This guy had grown more brazen and violent, having terrorized 5 victims, 5, for several hours. With his ski mask, gloves, and dark revolver, he'd confronted a young woman and her boyfriend in their bed. Trying to get up, the intruder pushed him down and stomped on his head. Duct tape was used to bind his hands, feet, and a pillowcase was put over his head. Who else was home? He demanded. And where was the money? Clearly, he had been watching them, because he also knew the couple had showered earlier. Confidence spilling over, he went from room to room, neutralizing the other men, forcing the 2 females to help him search for money. Angry, he began punching and hitting the men. Frustrated, he forced the women to strip and raped them repeatedly. He punched them and put his gun in their mouths. After the rapes, he forced the women to perform sex acts on each other, relishing the power and control. He sadistically attacked one of the males, burning him with a cigarette, tearing an earring from his ear, stabbing him with a fork in both legs, threatening to anally rape him with a floor lamp. He continually berated the men for not being able to protect their women. Before leaving, he made the women get into a bathtub to wash. He exited with $800. So much evidence was left behind. An orange juice container he drank from, cigarette butts, shoe imprints, and the duct tape. Oh, these poor people. Rape kits were collected at the hospital. And I'd be deeply concerned about this guy. One of these times, he is going to pull the trigger when that revolver is in somebody's mouth. This guy is dangerous and escalating. The media and public were in a panic as a task force was created, combining the resources of Tacoma PD, Pierce County Sheriff, King County Sheriff, Washington State Patrol, and the AG Office HITS Unit. Kings County Sheriff Detective Kathy Decker was part of the task force, and she was a man tracker. Okay, so what, pray tell, is a man tracker? Detective Decker was trained to track a human by interpreting footwear impressions, changes to the ground, vegetation, and surrounding environment. Many of the man tracker skills mirror those of hunters tracking their prey. Well, of course, the police would have such personnel. That makes sense. I just never thought about it before. Decker was able to identify partial shoe prints on the apartment linoleum floor and parking lot, determining where he'd likely parked his car. They learned his shoes were Nike Shox Ride 2s. And this was different from the Nike worn in Amy's case. On Halloween, an old patrol partner called Lindsey. He had a home invasion at the Hill that sounded like her guy. A 60-year-old woman had reported a prowler twice that night, with the responding patrol failing to find anyone. Well, it was later when a man threw a brick through her window, jumping through the broken glass into a bedroom where a small child was sleeping. Ski mask on, armed with a gun, he had Grandma and her 2 grandchildren walk him through the whole house, and then he fled. Calling 911, the responding officers found the outside lights were disabled and the phone line cut. Grandma was thankful to be alive, and she told the News Tribune, quote, "When he came in, he had every intention to hurt us," end quote. Lindsey believed her serial rapist had struck again. Brad went to interview the terrified woman and learned that her 20-year-old granddaughter, who frequently stayed with Grandma, wasn't home that night. Comparing the photo of this young woman with the fur crest victim, there was a strong resemblance, convincing Lindsey that his intended victim was fortunately not there that night. Then she learned of a second attack happening that night, but the responding patrol officers hadn't connected it to the serial rapist, which was exasperating given the notices that went out, the bulletins, the task force, the publicity in the news. The officer insisted it was neighbors in dispute over an Xbox, and Lindsey called bullshit on this. The second attack. About 5 a.m., an unknown black male armed with a revolver entered a condo at North 16th and Pearl Street. He confronted 2 men and a woman who had been sleeping. Binding the men with duct tape, he put duct tape over the woman's eyes, hid cell phones, and demanded money. Forcing the female to strip, he ordered her to call her 17-year-old sister and tell her to come over. The sister arrived as the 2 male victims got loose, jumping from the bathroom window. They ran next door, having a neighbor call 911. Realizing the 2 men had escaped, the suspect grabbed a pack of Marlboro Blue cigarettes and fled. Now, how that evolved into some kind of Xbox dispute is completely puzzling to me, but the original officers had titled the report robbery. And then came the third attack. Des Moines is a small town in West Kings County, 20 miles from Tacoma. So we are not in Iowa, I promise you. Right before 10 p.m., a perpetrator got inside an apartment building. A 24-year-old woman and her 12-year-old brother had just come home from a Halloween event. Home mere minutes, they heard a knocking on the building's outside door and looked outside, seeing no one. Hearing more knocking, 3 of the family's kids went out into the hall, thinking this was a Halloween prank, when a black male with a ski mask appeared, pointing his gun at the 20-year-old victim's head. Forcing them back inside their apartment, he threatened to kill the whole family if they resisted. The parents, 2 younger adult sisters, a 12-year-old boy, and a toddler were duct taped. Yes, he duct taped the toddler as he collected cell phones, hiding them while demanding money. The 20 and 24-year-old sisters were forced to strip and raped for hours. He then forced them to shower and made them get dressed and duct taped them again, leaving a pair of scissors nearby. Paraphrasing now, he commanded, "Wait 10 minutes, then set yourselves free." If they called the police, he'd return and kill them. He left. And about 3 minutes later, returned, testing them. Utterly terrified, they waited 10 hours to report the attack after one victim revealed what had happened to a coworker. By now, the public was completely terrified. Lindsey was consumed by the case, her anxiety spiking as she choked back thoughts of where he might strike next. This guy was so bold. No one was immune. Lindsey turned her own home into Fort Knox, which is very understandable since she knew way too much about these crimes. He was targeting females, but a common denominator couldn't be found. Most were young, attractive, light or olive skin with dark hair. And he did his homework, watching them, determining who lived in the home before breaking in. Tacoma PD canvassed the neighborhoods, the Tacoma Mall, handing out Crime Stoppers flyers to businesses. They did learn that 2 victims had been shopping at the mall and 1 was employed there. So was this where they had been spotted by the rapist? Tips came in being worked hard. DNA was taken, tested, and none matched the suspect. November 8th, 2005, at 11 p.m., 13 and 15-year-old sisters, Hannah and Tasha Jones, were in their bedroom when a black male wearing a ski mask entered. Gun pointed at them, the girls froze in terror as he demanded money. Taking their cell phones, he threatened to shoot them if they woke up their mother, who was sleeping on the living room sofa. Demanding money, they had none, and he got angry. He ordered them to strip and sexually assaulted them. At some point, their mother did awaken and come in, with the suspect forcing her back into the living room, tying her up with duct tape placed over her eyes and mouth. He forced Tasha to shower and, taking some pills, fell asleep. Around 5:30 a.m., with the suspect still out cold, the girls freed themselves and their mother, fled next door, where they called 911. The Federal Way Police Department responded, surrounding the apartment. Around 7 a.m., the suspect walked out onto the balcony, bare chest, wearing a ski mask, armed with a gun. Ordered to drop the weapon, he ran back inside. Then he hurled objects at the police from the balcony. After shooting him with a taser failed, the suspect jumped onto the ground, attempting to flee. Shot in the arm, he was taken into custody. It turned out the object he'd hurled off the balcony was a black revolver. Lindsey was notified that a suspect was in hand. This home invasion rape, again, mirrored the other cases she was investigating. At the hospital, the suspect lied about his name, but his fingerprints revealed he was Anthony Caspar Diaz, having 1 conviction for driving when his license was suspended, with no felony convictions. Well, he denied raping anyone, but the telltale duct tape was still stuck to his underwear when he was apprehended at the residence of the last victims, making his claim absurd. Devastatingly, Diaz was married and a father of 2. A search warrant of his residence revealed the motherlode of evidence: a device to test phone lines, a dark ski mask, ammo, gloves, duct tape, and a pack of Marlboro Blue 72 cigarettes, identical to what was taken in the Halloween assault. All the other cigarettes in Diaz's home were Kools. A search of his car found an empty package of duct tape, gloves with the number 207 written on the palm, the number of the victim's apartment. He was booked into Pierce County Jail for rape, kidnapping, and burglary, all first degree. A search warrant was issued to compare his DNA with the profile DNA taken from Jada Simpson, the toothbrush from Amy Williams, a cigarette butt from the King County scene, and a Coke can and cigarette from the Des Moines scene. When his wife visited him in jail, Diaz was caught writing notes to her, then tearing them up. Collected, the pieces were taped back together. With duct tape, maybe? And revealed very damning statements. And you should really read the book to get the whole picture, because it is a lot and it is devastating. Diaz's trial lasted 8 intense weeks. Lindsey's testimony painted the horrific picture of the crimes committed against these victims. When a call came that the verdict was in, she literally leapt over her desk, grabbing Brad, and headed to the courthouse. The jury had found Anthony Caspar Diaz guilty on all accounts. He was sentenced to 227 years in prison, and that was for the crimes committed in Pierce County alone. Diaz's defense attorney came up to Lindsey and Brad on the courthouse stairs, shaking their hand. He thanked them for getting a dangerous man off the streets. In 2007, Diaz died of natural causes at age 37. A few years later, the Diaz sexual assault spree was used as a justification to change the DNA collection laws in Washington. Sponsored by Washington State Senator Jeannie Darnelli, the bill failed. Well, that made me sad, and that was a mistake, Washington State. Lindsey writes that according to DNASaves.org, 31 states require DNA collection at the time of arrest for felony crimes, which makes perfect sense to me. Some believe it is too invasive, violating the suspect's rights, because he hasn't been convicted yet, you see. Well, Lindsey says at the time of arrest, photos are taken, fingerprints are taken, name, age, social security, address, next of kin, medical history, and people are strip searched. Quote, I have a hard time understanding how a cheek swab is more invasive than bending over and spreading your ass cheeks. End quote. So why not take DNA, which is a crucial investigative tool, and science has no bias. It doesn't lie. DNA can be used to catch a bad guy. It also exonerates the innocent. Well, in May 2007, taking a relaxing vacation in Mexico with husband Ed, Lindsey picked up a little light reading a true crime book, Missing the Oregon City Girls, a shocking true story of abduction and murder. And I am looking into this book because I'm very interested. It left an impression, and Lindsey began to wonder if something like this could happen in Tacoma. Her concern was prophetic. 2 months later, on Independence Day, the phone rang at 10:30 p.m. She saw Sergeant Davidson's phone number on the caller ID and groaned. He told her to come in, kidnapping of a 12-year-old girl. Child abductions do occur, of course, but often the child is actually just out of place, unexpectedly at a family member's house, or had fallen asleep and not go home and not called, not wanting to wake up parents, afraid they're going to get in trouble. But this time was different. Zina Linnik was missing. Responding officers searched the family home. No Zina. An Amber Alert was ordered. Interviews with family were conducted by detectives, but the family was Ukrainian and the language barrier made it difficult, so the older children acted as translators. Slender with long blonde hair, big brown eyes, Zina was one of the 8 Linnik children. July 4th was spent at home, and that evening, the kids went to the end of their alley to watch fireworks at a neighbor's home. Zina had come home, and about 9:30 p.m., her dad asked her to round up her brothers and sisters. She left the house, and her dad heard a scream from the alley. Recognizing Zina's voice, he ran out to investigate and saw a gray van parked nearby. An Asian male, about 5'8", or 1.8 meters, slender, wearing a baseball cap and jeans, he moved around the van, got into the driver's seat, and drove off. Zina was nowhere to be found. All the Linniks now began looking, finding her pink flip-flop in the same alley near where the van had been parked. After 15 minutes, Zina's older sister called 911, saying a Cambodian man took her sister. The license plate had the numbers 167 and some letters. Now, Zina Linnik was a good kid, going into 7th grade that fall. She didn't have a boyfriend, a cell phone, or the internet at home. Oh, those wonderful days when no social media making kids crazy, right? Updated, Lindsey found that a man, Dan Lowe, owner of a gray van, lived near the Linnik family. Filing for a search warrant, Lindsey researched what she could about Dan Lowe. And meanwhile, the Amber Alert was put on hold. Picking up Dan Lowe's brother, His silver Toyota minivan was in the driveway, but empty. The brother directed them to where Dan Lowe might be. Detectives knocked on the door, hearing noises of people scurrying about inside. Well, it turns out that Dan Lowe had received a phone call warning and had taken off. A K-9 unit was now dispatched to track Lowe, who would ultimately surrender to the police. Zina was not in the Lowe house. Dan Lowe denied any involvement in Zina's kidnapping. He'd run because his brother said the police were looking for him, and he didn't know why. He consented to have his van searched, and no evidence was found to link him to Zina. Given a polygraph test, Dan Lowe passed. 4 a.m. The call-out team was without leads, and the Amber Alert went out. Implemented in Washington state in 2003, Zina's Amber Alert was Tacoma's first. As of December 31st, 2023, there are now 82 Amber Alert plans in effect in the United States, and 1,200 children were successfully recovered through the Amber Alert system. By the way, if you haven't seen Peacock's Amber, the Girl Behind the Alert, it's disturbingly worthy, but worthy. July 5th, search and rescue teams of volunteers were out looking for Zina. Search dogs were out as well. A mobile command post was set up, and the media descended on the neighborhood. The FBI brought in 40 special agents to assist, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children sent Team Adam consultants. That is, retired law enforcement volunteers with an expertise in child abduction investigations. Quickly, the number of police on the case reached 150. A list of vehicles with a 167 license plate was compiled, plus a list of registered sex offenders living within a half mile, 0.8 kilometers, was generated, with 40 names on the list. A massive canvassing effort began, and a tip line was established. Leads were evaluated, assigned, and tracked. The investigation would run 24/7 for 8 days. That evening, Brad and Lindsey re-interviewed Zina's dad, Zina Linnik, his daughter now missing 24 hours. Mr. Linnik gave them more details about the van he'd seen: 2 clear back windows, a bumper that was the same color as the van. Looking over photographs of vans, he was able to narrow down the one he'd seen to a Toyota or a Volkswagen. The license plate that he had seen had a 677 or a 667 with a letter before and after. July 6th, with no solid leads, Lindsey dove into the law enforcement database, hoping to find useful information. And she found 2 reports that were of interest. March 2006, at Wright Park, less than 2 miles, so 3.2 kilometers, from the Linnik home, an Asian male driving a silver Toyota van was watching women and creeping them out. And the second was a vehicle prowl report from a Lowe's store back in May. A white male, Jacob Fry, reported his tools were stolen while he was inside shopping. His van was a gray Chevy Astro, license plate B17667B. Forwarding the information so it could be logged and acted upon, Lindsey and Brad headed to check out the creeper in the park, which seemed the more promising lead of the 2. Now, this van's owner had a solid alibi, and they found his van with no signs of Zina. Detective Stephanie Wilrich and FBI Special Agent Ten Holla were following up the Jacob Fry lead. That evening, detectives, officers, and agents surrounded the house next to Zina's. Earlier, when canvassing, a male resident was spoken with, and he was nervous and acting sketchy. His answers were evasive and unconvincing. Bloodhounds were brought in, and several alerted that they detected Zina's scent. Now, the resident was not home, so the door was kicked in, and no Zina was found. Tips came in with nothing of significance being identified. A psychic called in suggesting locations where Zina could be located. And while this isn't given a whole lot of priority, it was investigated. No Zina. July 7th, Mr. Linnik, his son, Dan Lowe, and Zina's next-door neighbor were all given polygraphs, and all passed. Detective Stephanie Wilrich and FBI Special Agent Ten Hala met with Jacob Fry, the Lowe's guy who had his tools stolen. It turns out the van belonged to his employer, Turpan Adhan. They ran a background check on Adhan, and he was a 45-year-old Asian male who fit the physical description given by Mr. Linnik. He was also a level 1 sex offender, which means he's least likely to reoffend. Unfortunately, the address on record was not where he currently lived. They attempted to track Adhan's cell phone, finally coming to a location near 112th and Pacific in Parkland, a Tacoma suburb. His van was spotted. Surveillance was set up. Detective Brad Graham and another detective in one car, Lindsey in another a few blocks away. The license plate had been switched out with one belonging to an Oldsmobile. Then Brad reported seeing Adhan walking out his front door and eventually right past Lindsey. While out of her jurisdiction, having no idea where she was, she followed him and, fearing he might run, drew her weapon and yelled for him to stop. "Show me your hands." He did, clearly nervous. Well, I can't blame him for being nervous. I think I'd be nervous too. Brad joined Lindsey and they went back to Adhan's house. Undergoing renovation, there was little furniture, but he had 2 little kittens in a crate in his bedroom. Now, this was not a man who seemed to be an animal lover. Doing what she did best, Lindsey snooped, as Brad interviewed. A construction worker, he had had dinner with a friend on July 4th, and he went home to watch TV, although he couldn't recall what he watched. He'd done a few jobs that day and come home. When they asked about the switched plates, he said they'd been stolen about 6 months earlier, so he took the plates off an abandoned car and put them on his van. Asked about his sex offender status, he admitted molesting his sister in 1990, resulting in the fact that most of his family had cut him off. Well, you think? He knew the police had asked Jacob Fry about his van, and he denied having anything to do with Zina's kidnapping. As they continued to talk, more agents converged on the house, with Adhan becoming more anxious. He invoked his right to an attorney, and the interview ended, which is his right, not an admission of guilt. Taken to the station while his property was being secured, they left him in an interview room. There, he began to bang on the door, saying he needed sleep. "Book me or let me go." Well, as you wish. They arrested him for a visa overstay violation. Lindsey then wrote a search warrant for a more thorough search of his residence. Executed by the FBI Evidence Response Team, the van was problematic. There were no rear seats. It was very empty. His tools were inside his home, so they wouldn't be stolen again, he claimed. There were 2 large plywood boxes built into the cargo space where a 12-year-old would fit inside, but there was nothing that obviously linked him to Zina's abduction. His neighbors did not report seeing a little blonde girl, but one reported seeing him jumping over fences in their backyard shortly before the police converged on his house. So, what have they got on Adhan? Sex offender who physically matched the description given by Zina's dad. He drove a gray van, license plate containing the partial numbers reported by her father. The switched license plate was suspicious as hell, and he had no credible alibi. Yet there was nothing that directly tied him to Zina's kidnapping, the house, and the van not producing any viable evidence. Digging deeper now into his background, he was working construction now, but had been in the U.S. Army, stationed in Fort Lewis in South Pierce County in the late 80s and into the 90s. He had also worked as a tow truck driver. His family was interviewed, and searches of all the location where he had done construction were conducted. A 2004 Child Protective Service referral surfaced, saying that Adhan was having sex with 15-year-old Lana Naw. Lana's mother had sold her to Adhan for sex. This referral had not been investigated previously. The FBI located referral victim, Lana Naw, now an adult living out of state. Her story of living with Adhan was grim. He raped her repeatedly, threatening her with a gun. Terrified, she left, going to live with a friend. Now, a few unsolved cases were explored in connection to him. In May 2000, an 11-year-old girl, Sarah Erickson, was found by a U.S. soldier walking along a road by Fort Lewis, duct tape around her wrists, carrying a stick. Sarah said she was walking to school when a man driving a black truck grabbed her. Inside the truck, he tied her up with duct tape, covering her eyes and mouth. He drove to a remote training area on Fort Lewis and brutally sexually assaulted her. Sarah found her way back to the main road when the soldier found her. At the hospital, surgery was needed to treat Sarah's injuries.
Oof.
Her description of her attacker. He was Asian or Hispanic male, short hair, flat on top. He drove a black pickup with an extended back. Working with Detective Steve Shake, they created a composite sketch of the suspect. Detectives located the crime scene with plaster casts made of rather unique TSL Thornbird off-road tires. A male DNA profile was obtained from Sarah's rape kit, but no matches were found in the DNA databases. Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Mary Robnett filed a John Doe warrant against the unknown male, using the DNA profile as an identifier. This would keep the statute of limitations from running out on this case. Was this the work of Adhan? Another case caught their attention. December 2nd, 2005. 10-year-old Adriana Jackson left her home in Tillicum for school. Tillicum is located close to Fort Lewis. She didn't know that school was having a snow day and was closed, and Adriana never made it back home. As this information was being collected, the search for Zina continued with a huge number of volunteers. And it came to an end. Zina was found under a tree in a shaded area, dumped like discarded trash. Locking the deep sadness away, the evidence response team was summoned. Her body was transported to the Pierce County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy, and Zina's devastated parents were notified. She had died of blunt force trauma to the head and asphyxiation after sexual assault. Well, now another Adnan search warrant produced more evidence, an empty roll of duct tape and a dildo wrapped in a paper towel in the trash. Adhan's DNA was found to match the oral swabs collected from Zina at autopsy. His profile also matched with Sarah Erickson's kidnapping rape from 2000. Charges came down for murder, kidnapping, and 7 counts of rape, including those for Lana Naw. He would plead guilty and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Zina's cousin, Paul Chalik, told the court, quote, "I can't imagine what kind of mindset one would have to go out and prey on innocents. She was just a little girl, a child. To go out, tear upon, and do what you did sickens me." End quote. I have to agree. During his interview with FBI profiler Special Agent Jennifer Eakin, Tarapan Adhan revealed what happened to Zina. Mad at his ex-wife who hadn't picked up the phone, thus denying him a visit with his son, Adhan went hunting for a victim. Drinking alcohol, he decided to, quote, destroy a human, end quote. He noticed Zina riding her bike. Following her into the alley, he turned his van around, guaranteeing a quick exit. He approached her as she got to her gate. Quote, "Does this alley go all the way through?" End quote. Well, she didn't know, and she turned to walk into her backyard when he grabbed her, covering her mouth with one hand, dragging her into the back of the van, where he taped her wrists and mouth. Driving down the hill, he was on his way to his house, listening to her praying in a foreign tongue. He reached over and tightened the zip tie around her throat to keep her quiet. Opening the sliding door of the van once he parked in a carport, he realized the girl was dead. He didn't kill her intentionally. Really?
What happened to the blunt force trauma? I thought that was the cause of death.
Oh. Carrying her inside, he sexually assaulted her and put her in his laundry room. Later, he dumped her where she was found. Heading home, Lindsey felt a deep ache within her chest, and she let herself cry for the little girl. Several years later, it was Lindsey Wade who established Tacoma's Child Abduction Response Team, CART, the 20th in the country. Certified by the U.S. Department of Justice, it's a multidisciplinary team from several agencies working in concert to investigate abductions. While conducting an annual mock trial abduction exercise, Lindsey invited Jennifer Bastian's mom, Patty, to attend, assuring her that Jennifer was not forgotten. In the aftermath, Lindsey became an instructor for Amber Alert training and the Technical Assistance Program at Fox Valley Technical College, training hundreds of law enforcement around the country on missing children and cold case investigation. In 2008, Lindsey was transferred to the Homicide Unit. Working with Sergeant Tom Davidson, he was one of the greatest detectives Lindsey worked with during her career. They were joined by Dan Davis, also a talented detective. And they had cracked one of Tacoma's more infamous cases, the Trang Dai Cafe Massacre. Back on July 5, 1998, wearing masks, an Asian gang stormed into the Trang Dai Cafe and opened fire, killing 4 men and a woman, wounding 5 others. A complicated investigation. Witnesses were few and reluctant to come forth. Fear permeated the community, terrified of retribution by the gang. A suspect was arrested and committed suicide. Another killed his brother and then himself in the parking lot when detectives were closing in, ready to arrest them. The intricate investigation did result in 6 arrests and convictions for the spree killing. What a nightmare. When Lindsey joined Homicide, she was their only female detective and only the 3rd female in Homicide Unit history. Not long after, Detective Stephanie Wilrich, Louise Nist, and Vicki Chittick joined the unit. Most of the time, a woman in a male-dominated field wasn't something that fazed Lindsey. Having to take off your holster without dropping it on the floor to pee is quickly mastered. But occasionally, something would remind her of her sex. One day, qualifying at the range, she happened to have the top score. While she wasn't a bad shot, being the top scorer was somewhat unusual. As she was cleaning her Glock, she overheard a male detective speaking to some others. Quote, "She's married to the range master. No wonder." End quote. Well, she chuckled. This guy was clearly upset over losing to a girl. And Buddy, hanging out at the range with hubby, was not Lindsey's idea of date night. Oh. Early in her career, Lindsey felt pressure to do better, to prove herself. But after time, she knew her work spoke for itself. In patrol, a uniform was mandatory, but detectives wore civilian clothing. And while she dressed professionally, she was decidedly female. Her nails were painted a bold color, and she wore her red patent leather flats, called her Dorothy slippers by Jean Miller. She writes that what we see on TV gives being a detective a glamorous feel to it, and that is far, far from the truth. Paraphrasing now, none wear Armani suits. Getting assigned to a case, you may be there for 8 hours to multiple days, depending on the nature of the case. Not fun facts. Corpses smell bad. Houses can be filthy and uninhabitable. There are bugs and rodents and droppings as well. And going to the medical examiner's office was not a favorite journey, and it was a bad day when you could smell the decay from the observation room. For a few years, Lindsey was assigned to missing persons as she continued to work on cold cases in her spare time. April 23, 1990, 19-year-old Susan Lowe was at home watching the Seattle Supersonics play on TV. Extroverted, she worked at a local furniture store. Donna, her roommate, saw Susan around 7 p.m. Donna returned around 10:30 p.m., and she didn't see anything amiss and went to bed. When Susan didn't get up the next morning, Donna went to wake her, but she didn't rouse. She called for help. Bellevue police arrived around 8 a.m., and they deduced that an unknown assailant had entered the apartment, sexually assaulting her, then strangling Susan Lowe with her own pantyhose. Canvassing the neighbors, one was watching Charlie's Angels on TV when they heard a knocking on Susan's door. Then they heard, quote, a banging noise, like something hitting a wall, then a running sound followed by a muffled scream, end quote. They evidently shrugged it off. Oh dear. Susan Lowe's case went cold when the minimal leads they had proved to be a dead end. And DNA wasn't a thing yet. In 1997, Detective Jerry Johnson was assigned the very cold Susan Lowe case. He started off organizing the file, creating an index so he could keep track of all the information, documents, photos, notes, and the like. Paper copies were digitalized, and he re-interviewed many witnesses and collected DNA samples from many persons of interest. 2 years later, evidence from Susan's autopsy was sent to a private DNA lab called Forensic Science Associates. A male DNA profile was obtained from the vaginal swabs. This profile was sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab with no match found. 3 years later, the evidence was re-examined with the latest scientific tools, and an enhanced DNA profile was now entered into the state and national databases, and there was no match. In 2006, King County Prosecutor's Office created a cold case unit with Susan Lowe's case the first to be reviewed. As new profiles are continually added to DNA databases, searches are regularly repeated at CODIS, the National DNA Index System, maintained by the FBI, as well as state depositories. The problem is, not all DNA samples are created equal, and those that do not meet the requirements are not uploaded. So you might ask, where does Lindsey fit into Susan Lowe's cold case? Well, hang on. We're going to get there, I promise. By June 2011, Lindsey was investigating a 1999 child abduction case when she reached out to the Washington State Department of Corrections about potential suspects in their system. The topic of the Special Committee Center on McNeil Island came up. Well, wait, what's that, you ask? All right, hold on. Give me a second. Lindsey asked, were all the Special Committee Center residents' DNA uploaded? I think so, was the response. That sounds like a no. So a bit of history here. What is the SCC on McNeil Island? All right, I had no idea about any of this. The Washington State Community Protection Act of 1990 was passed after the public became horrified by a series of high-profile sex crimes. 3 young boys were killed by serial killer Wesley Allen Dodd. Another boy was kidnapped, raped, and sexually mutilated by Ed Schreiner. And an abduction, rape, and murder of another young woman by a sex deviant out on work release occurred. So this 1990 law was passed, requiring sex offenders to register once released. It also increased sentencing guidelines for sex offenses and allowed for civil commitment of sexually violent predators, joining 20 other states by 2024. Well, wait, what is this? Okay, so the SCC on McNeil Island houses offenders who are legally deemed, quote, sexually violent predators, SVPs, end quote, previously convicted, who have now been civilly convicted. Now, not everyone convicted of a sex crime is an SVP. Proving a felon is an SVP is not an easy process, nor should it be. The state must prove 3 elements. 1, that the offender suffers from a mental abnormality or a personality disorder, which, 2, makes the likelihood of them reoffending blatantly obvious, and that the said person, 3, has grave difficulty controlling their sexually violent behavior. Okay, as Kansas's SVP law has been ruled constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, most other states have based their SVP laws on this one. A mental abnormality as a, quote, congenital or acquired condition affecting the emotional or volitional capacity which predisposes the person to commit sexually violent offenses in a degree constituting such person as a menace to the health and safety of others, end quote. That's a mental abnormality. Now, building a case is an enormous time and resource-sucking beast that must be meticulously documented in order to prove a case, because the abuse of this law would be horrendous. If these are proven at trial, the SVP is detained at the SCC indefinitely. However, due to its constitutional due diligence, periodic reviews of the person's mental condition are required. If the condition has changed so they no longer meet the criteria, they can be released or moved to a less restrictive environment. All right, there have been controversies associated with these laws, to say the least. The 20 states with SVP laws of some kind are Washington, California, Arizona, North Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Illinois, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Virginia, South Carolina, Florida, and Washington, D.C. As of 2020, according to UCLA's School of Law, Williams Institute, there are 6,300 VSPs in the United States of America. So, back to Lindsey's question. Was the DNA of the civilly committed SVPs in the DNA database? Most were, but several dozen SVPs on the SCC roster were not. What upset Lindsey most was that 9 of these offenders were deceased with no DNA samples collected. Well, many cold cases might be solved if the DNA of known perpetrators hadn't fallen through this crack. Lindsey now contacted the director of the SCC and learned the policy was to take DNA samples on release, not entry. The concept was that once an offender was committed, the likelihood of offending dropped, so its inclusion was irrelevant in the database. But do you see the problem? This policy focuses on possible future crimes, not possibly previous ones already committed, and perhaps not linked to the perpetrator yet. This leaves cold cases out in the cold. Well, Lindsey asked that the DNA samples be taken immediately, which did not happen. Months of calling and inquiring got her nowhere, and she got pissed. Woman after my own heart. She reached out to Assistant Attorney General Brooke Burbank in the Sexually Violent Predator Unit at the Washington State Attorney General's office. Caught up on the situation with the DNA, Brooke Burbank agreed to look into it. And the waiting began, as a frustrated Lindsey wondered if she was the only one who gave a damn that the DNA samples that had the potential to solve cold cases were sitting there. 2 years later, her persistence paid off. All the DNA, even the deceased SCC residents, were uploaded. And the SCC changed its DNA collection policy, shifting to obtaining it on entry. Lindsey Wade did that. That is how you make a difference and you change the world. Now you see why I love and admire this woman so much. Closing those cracks so perpetrators cannot fall through them is brilliant. And I love ending an episode on a high note. And I know I am ending the episode, but there's so much more to come. And we will get to the final episode of In My DNA in 2 weeks. Yes, we are back to every 2 weeks. Continuing her stellar police investigations, there are some shocking twists and turns that answer a number of long pondered questions as justice is achieved. And thank you, Patreon murder bookies. Our next book is Harvest of Innocence by Dan Steedham and Tom McCarthy on the West Memphis 3. I met Dan Steedham at CrimeCon 2024 in Nashville, and I could have listened to him talk about his book all day long. This isn't just about the murder of children, a breach of justice, the complexities of 3 defendants accused of murder 30 years ago, but the impact on his life as well. This is a personal story. This is not someone investigating a controversial case. He lived this controversial case. So read with me, or let me tell you the story with my usual analysis, research, and updates. Thank you for listening, Murder Bookies. I see you as you hear me. Please take a few minutes to leave an awesome review that will help me make new Murder Bookies. Share this podcast with your friends and relatives. Share your thoughts with me at jill@murdershelfbookclub.com, on X, Facebook, Instagram, and we are on YouTube. Links are on my blog, and you can still join Patreon for $4 a month, www.patreon.com/murdershelfbookclub. See you in 2 weeks, Murder Bookies. Written and produced by Jill, all rights reserved. Music, The Pewter Elephant by Blue Dot Sessions.